The last few fundamentals have dealt with placement of lights and working towards making them feel motivated and rooted in your scene. These next couple fundamentals deal with the actual quality of that light. Quality of light is a spectrum, ranging anywhere from soft to hard and anywhere in between. Your approach to choosing how to light the scene should stem from what the scene calls for. So, quality of light being a spectrum from soft to hard, but really beyond that spectrum, what is it? What does it look like? If you're framing up on your subject, what makes it soft light and what makes it hard light? The biggest differences between them are soft light is going to look more flattering. You're going to actually minimize hard shadows, and it naturally will sort of fill the face, as you sort of naturally, if you were to key with a soft source, you're not going to see a hard drop shadow right here. It's just going to softly wrap around. Hard light is very much the opposite. Hard light is actually something where if I was keying with it, you'd see a direct drop shadow. And this really correlates to size. And we're going to dive into that as we break down soft light and hard light. And basically talk about when we would use one over the other, when we would use one as a key versus a backlight, and vice versa. My approach as a cinematographer is usually to key with the soft light. Your goal as a cinematographer is to light your subject or an actor in the most flattering way possible, and also keep it looking cinematic. If you look at most movies, much like I did growing up, there tends to be a trend to make your subject, your actor, your star, your artist look good. They've hired you as a cinematographer for a reason. They're kind of leaning on your expertise to make them look good, So soft light is a great way to go about that. Soft light is usually, in most instances, used as your source for key, and usually fill is a soft return. You're using basically a bounce, which is the softest light possible, and you're just sort of sending some of that back. So usually the whole front side of your subject, the key and the fill, are inherently very soft. It's important to understand what makes soft light, like how do you achieve it? Sure, there are different rags, grids, silks, and diffusion. Every DP is going to have their favorite, but at the end of the day, it's not the fabric or diffusion itself, but the size. This was something that I really did not know for a while. I just thought, oh, okay, well, if we want it soft, just put a layer of diffusion, but I was not really understanding why it was soft. The why comes from the size. If something is bigger, it is going to be softer. If you are going to key me right here, the light will appear softer if it was being sent through a 12 by 12 frame of diffusion versus a 4 by 4 frame of diffusion. So if you just took a 1 by 1 light panel and shine it right in my face, it would appear very harsh. 1 feet by 1 feet is pretty small. But if you actually were to put that 1 by 1 light panel and send it through a 4 by 4 frame, now your light source is 4 feet big. The larger it is, it has a better chance at wrapping around and appearing softer, getting rid of harsh shadows. And then beyond that, if you took that 1 by 1 light panel and sent it through a 12 by 12 frame of diffusion, it's going to feel incredibly soft. So just to recap, the bigger the source, the softer it is. And sure, your strength and thickness of fabric do play into it, but ultimately understanding that bigger is better for achieving soft light is a great place to start. I think a great way to sort of put this together into context is when you shoot at blue hour or golden hour. The sun has just gone behind a mountain, the sun is gone, but what you're left with is just sort of a beautiful, 30 minutes of a fading blue sky. And that's incredibly soft. If you frame and have ever shot around that narrow window of time when the sun is just set, but you still have a good 30 to an hour, that is when the light is the softest. Because if you were to look up, the entire sky is your source. You're just getting soft ambient, light from the sky. You're not getting a harsh shadow from the sun. You're just getting a soft return. So, your blue hour stuff is gonna feel much softer. But if you went out at 2 p.m., if you were to look up at the sky, The sun's only about this big. It's much smaller, kind of back to our 1x1 light panel example. You can honestly look up and hold your finger up. The sun in relation to you is about the size of your fingernail. So that's a very small source, very bright source, but very small, So, being able to diffuse that and put that through diffusion, or in our example, if the sun was gone and you're just dealing with the entire sky as your source of light, it's gonna be much softer. So now understanding these concepts, as we've laid them out, here are our favorite ways to achieve soft lighting. The first being a double break. A double break is when you send a unit through 2 layers of diffusion. A workhorse for me on indie features or shoots where I have to move fairly quickly is a SkyPanel S60, which if you think about is only 2 1x1 light panels put together. That's essentially the diameter of an S60. So it's a very small source. But when you send it through a chimera bank, that's 1 break of diffusion. And if you send that SkyPanel once again with the chimera through an 8x8 frame, you're essentially turning a SkyPanel, which isn't that big, through 2 layers of diffusion. And by the time it hits your subject, it's incredibly soft. I think another tricky thing with a double break that some people don't understand, and it took me a while to understand, is you want your light to fill the entire frame. So if this was your SkyPanel and this is your diffusion, you want to walk your diffusion far enough away to where the entire diffusion frame is filled up. If you just literally put a SkyPanel and 6 inches away a 4x4 frame, your entire 4x4 frame isn't being filled. Circling back to larger is better. You want to fill your entire frame. So if you have an 8x8 frame right up against your chimera box, it's only going to illuminate maybe half of the 8x. So it defeats the purpose of the double break. So when you double break a light, sending it through 2 layers of diffusion, you want to spread them out far enough so light, a few feet, diffusion, a few feet, another layer of diffusion. That's going to yield the softest source. Another way to achieve soft light is by setting up a booklight. Booklight achieves its softness by bouncing a light into a large bounce, and then that bounce light is then once again diffused before hitting your subject. Where a double break, the unit is already pointed at the subject, you're just diffusing it twice. The booklight actually involves the light that's hitting your subject to be pointed away from your subject, it's being bounced, and then that bounce light before hitting your subject again is diffused. I will say this is the softest quality of light. If you can manage to booklight, it will yield the softest results because bounce light inherently is very soft. I will say the only downside of a booklight is you need an entire grip village. Not only do you need the bounce and the diffusion to make the booklight work, but you also need a ton of flags to keep light from scattering and bouncing around. Circling back to our previous section of this course, where every surface in your room is going to reflect light. If you have a white ceiling and a bunch of white walls, a booklight is sort of sending light everywhere, into your bounce. So you really need to tent that in, and that can take a lot of time. So though it yields the softest light, in my opinion, it does require the most amount of manpower to make it work. And it also does require quite a bit of gear. So my vote is the double break, just because it's a little more simple and straightforward. And both totally work to achieve soft light. Now that we know how to create hard light by having a smaller size source, when would you use hard light? Well, for me, my favorite use for hard light is a backlight, especially if you've keyed and filled your subject on the front side of their face with soft light. Having hard light give them a back or an edge looks really nice. It just gives you a lot of contrast. It makes them sort of jump off the screen. It's a great way to light and approach your scene and subject. Another time you can use hard light to your advantage is to create patterns and textures in your set. Say you're framed up on your subject, and behind them there's a pretty boring, uninteresting wall with no set dressing, nothing going on. What you can do is make that interesting with hard light. Instead of just shining a bright light at it, try putting the light outside and sending it through, some blinds, maybe sending it through a tree branch. And what's going to end up happening is the hard light's going to cast shadows of whatever's in front of it. So those blinds will kind of create a nice rake. The tree branches might play nicely on the wall. You can use, hard light to your advantage to sort of send shadows and send things, that maybe otherwise wouldn't be there. If you circle back to early 1930s and 40s when like film noir was very big, they'd use hard light all the time to add slashes to walls to really sort of show you where your eye should look or not look. So you can use hard light not just only on your subject, but on how you also light your set as well. I find hard light is best used when you're shooting a dark and moodier scene. When you're dealing with values that are on the lower end of your false color, which we are going to break down much later on, but say you're lighting a scene that's very moody and intimate, and a lot of your values in your key and your fill are actually feeling a bit under, a quick way to sort of trick the eye or trick the viewer into making the scene not feel muddy and dark is to have a bright source of light in your frame. This can be a bare exposed light bulb, this can be some hard light, essentially raking through the back wall, but this essentially allows there to be a bright source in your image so the darker stuff in the foreground, maybe your actor that you're lighting, doesn't just feel like it's so tonal and so dark. Because of all the values in your frame, your subject, your background are all on the lower end, all very dark, it's going to feel very muddy. But if you like the way these values are feeling on your subject, maybe dark, maybe you're going for a low-key lighting, a real nice way to make that stand out is by adding hard light behind your subject. Not necessarily as a backlight, but even just scattering or raking against the back wall. Now you've added contrast, you've added a highlight to your frame. So now you're playing around with the shadows in the foreground with your subject, and now the hard light is giving a higher end, so you've kind of filled the whole spectrum of, shadows and highlights, I think a good way of explaining this is, if you look at a painting by Ansel Adams, he's known for having all the tones of black and white, from the deepest blacks to the richest whites. But if you got rid of all the whites and you were just dealing with the blacks, it'd be a pretty uninteresting photograph to look at. I think what makes his photograph so striking is, his ability to, have the whole range of contrast. So to circle back, if you're lighting a scene very low key, your values are very dark, your subject is lit very dark, you want to essentially get those whites back in. You want to get the upper range of the contrast, and instead of hitting your subject with it, which would defeat the purpose of your low-key lighting, by having an HMI or a mirror board, something that can produce hard light, hitting the light in the back of your set, back wall of some sort, it'll really create contrast. These have been some of our favorite ways to use hard light when lighting your subject, scene, or set.